On the morning of April 15th, 2007, a customer walked into the Baekap Dabang, or the Lily Cafe, a small coffee and tea shop in Daejeon, South Korea. The first thing the customer saw was a woman, 45-year-old Miss E, crouched on the floor. She was shaking. Her back was turned to them. When the customer went to pass the crouched woman, they saw she was drenched in blood. In one hand, she was clutching a large knife. Her other hand was wrapped against her side as blood gushed out of a massive wound in her abdomen. She was desperately trying to keep in her own organs. The customer called the police and paramedics, and when emergency services arrived, no one could make sense of what had happened. Medics rushed to stabilize the woman who had lost so much blood. They were shocked she was even conscious. The officers who stayed behind at the scene investigated the blood trail that came from the back of the cafe. The drops of blood led them to a small employee restroom where they discovered what truly had happened. On the cold tile floor was the body of 47-year-old Miss Che. She had been brutally murdered. The investigators' initial assessment was that this was a robbery homicide. The cash register was short about 30,000 won, or $20. But the savagery of the murder was wildly disproportionate to the petty theft of $20. They had a victim dead, a woman in surgery from her wounds, and more questions than they could expect answers to. Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Welcome back to the show. I know I've been gone for 2 whole weeks, both for a vacation and due to another horrible flare-up with my spine, but I'm back, and happily so. Thank you to my amazing patrons who have made this show possible. You can support Korean True Crime today on Patreon. Also join us on Discord for movie nights featuring films based off of real crimes. If you want to chat with me or other listeners, you can join us on Discord. All of my merch, including Korean True Crime logo shirts and sweaters, are now available on the Fourth Wall shop. Make sure to check your size and don't be a dummy like me and order a size too small. Warning. Today's episode contains some graphic descriptions of murder, including gore, as well as mentions of sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. Before the bloody cafe scene, the morning of April 15th, 2007, the cafe opening was pretty standard. Shintanjindong, where the cafe was located, is a pretty industrial area. The one thing it's known for is that it has the largest cigarette factory in Korea. I tried learning a little bit more about this area, but there's really not much. Just farms and factories. Some apartment blocks as well. The Lily Cafe was a part of this quaint industrial area. It was a simple neighborhood cafe where locals could get a cheap cup of coffee, tea, or some snacks on their breaks. Miss Che and Miss E were 2 of the women running the cafe. They were, according to those who knew them, pretty ordinary women in their 40s. They were working to make ends meet and were kind to customers who came in. No one could imagine anyone who might want to hurt either of the 2 women. Miles away from the cafe, 35-year-old Oh Yi-gyun started his day by visiting his father's grave in Changwon. After he paid his respects, he stopped at a local poker arcade and decided to test his luck for that day. Perhaps he felt lucky, or he just had an incredible lack of foresight, but he gambled away all of his cash he had on him. He left the place penniless, and when he left, he realized he had lost literally everything. He was standing at the train station, stranded, because he didn't even have enough money to pay the 3,000 won fare to get back to Seoul. That would be like a few dollars. He didn't even have pocket change. For Oh Yi-gyun, his desperation and realization that he had been hitting rock bottom for a long time now suddenly became enough. It was enough for him to believe his life was over. He had nothing left to live for, nothing to hope for, nothing he cared about. He felt pathetic, so he started walking. He walked along the highway with no real destination in mind. But despite having no money, he wasn't really empty-handed. That day, when he went out to visit his father's grave, he knew that this was the day he would completely detach from his reality, because he had with him 2 knives. He walked alongside the highway, which was surrounded by steep cliffs on either side of forestry and farmhouses, until in the distance, he saw the Lily Cafe. It was 8:45 a.m., and the woman inside, Miss Che, was just beginning to prepare the cafe to open. That's something that was difficult to get used to in Korea for me, was I wanted to get a drink of coffee before I went to work, but cafes were not open until 9 or 10 a.m. Eventually, more coffee chains started to open early, but for a leisurely cafe in the industrial neighborhood, the Lily Cafe was catering more to a lunch break crowd. When Oi-gyun walked in, the cafe was quiet. Miss Che wasn't in the lobby. She also wasn't expecting any customers that early, so she was outside cleaning. Oi-gyun took out the 2 mountaineering-style knives he had with him, and he didn't hesitate to make his way into the cafe. He acted almost like the entire walk there he had thought exactly how he would act. He was acting deliberately. First, he moved to the cash register, forced it open. He stole the 30,000 won inside. But he wasn't really there for a robbery. This was just a prelude to what he really was intending to do. He pocketed the money as Miss Che returned to the main cafe lobby. She had been cleaning outside and wasn't suspecting to see him. When she saw Oi-gyun standing beside the register, stuffing the cash into his pocket, she was frozen in terror. But after that initial shock, she started to yell at him. She didn't know about the knives he had, so she was trying to scare him off. But he immediately lunged at her, and she turned to flee. But the cafe was tiny, just big enough for a few small tables inside. There was nowhere for her to go. He quickly chased her down and grabbed her. He pulled her into the back room and forced her into the small employee restroom. There, he cornered her and started to attack her with the knives. To say he brutally killed her would minimize the violence, because he slashed her throat and continued to stab her in the neck until she was near decapitated. His motivation wasn't money. He wanted to exert his homicidal rage. And when he was done, he didn't flee. He didn't even clean himself up. He didn't try to hide her body. He was unbelievably calm. For the next 15 minutes, he just sat at one of the cafe's tables waiting. 15 minutes is a pretty long time to just sit and wait quietly after killing someone. So this tells us a lot about what his psyche was. He had no panic, no remorse, no fear of being discovered. It was almost as if he was waiting to see what would happen next. And after 15 minutes, the bell on the door jingled. Miss E opened the door expecting to come into the cafe prepped for their day of work. She would begin her shift, but instead she saw Oi-gyun sitting covered in blood, staring at her. She immediately called out for Miss Che, but Oi-gyun stood up and closed the distance between them. Before she could scream, he stabbed the knife into her abdomen. But the shock and fear Miss E was feeling caused her instincts to fight back to kick in, and she fought back. She started kicking, scratching, screaming, punching. Her violent struggle really unnerved Oi-gyun, and he decided to flee. He left her collapsed on the floor, a knife sticking out of her abdomen, miraculously still alive somehow. And thankfully, an approaching customer heard her screams, came rushing in to find her and call for help. The investigation into the attack was spearheaded by the local Daejeon Bukbu police. The level of violence the detective saw was described by them as deeply personal and explosive. They didn't believe that this was a first-time offender for sure. They started combing through the crime scene, trying to find something that would identify the assailant. The forensics team worked for hours, dusting every single surface in the cafe, trying to collect hairs, fingerprints, anything. They were taking samples of every single droplet of blood, hoping one would identify the killer. They thought they'd actually collected quite a bit of evidence. They successfully lifted dozens of latent prints and collected about 20 hair samples from the cafe. But a dabang, a cafe, is quite literally, by its very nature, very transient space. Dozens of customers would have been there in the previous day, each leaving behind fingerprints and stray hairs. The fingerprints on the tables, the door handle, the register, the coffee cups, they could belong to literally anyone. The police sifting through all of that contaminated data to find one print that didn't belong to a customer or one of the workers was statistically an impossible task if they didn't have a suspect in mind. So the initial forensic sweep, although it was hopeful, it was a dead end. Really, their only hope was Miss E, the woman who was stabbed in the abdomen, but she was in surgery fighting for her life. She had survived, but just barely. When she finally was awake and able to speak, she couldn't even remember getting to the cafe that day. The psychological and physical trauma she endured completely rewired her memory. The human brain has a brutal but effective way of protecting itself from an event that it can't consciously process. For Miss E, her memory wasn't fuzzy. It was completely gone. This isn't just her forgetting or trying to forget what happened. Her brain didn't even create a memory of that event. Her mind recognized that what was happening was too much for her conscious self to handle, so it disconnected the memory-making process. Of course, there's a lot of complex science that goes into why this happens, but this process is called disassociation. It's self-preservation. Simultaneously, her body was fighting to stay alive. A life-threatening injury like the one she sustained leads to a flood of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. In high quantities, this hormone disrupts the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for taking short-term memory and turning it into a long-term memory. The result of both the physical and psychological trauma is that her brain just didn't record the incident. The detectives, though, were hoping that she could give them some information, but she couldn't remember anything. The police were so desperate at this point for a lead that they even began to contact hypnotherapists to conduct hypnosis to try to unlock some memories that may have been suppressed in her memory. Keep in mind, we have talked about this before. We know now, in today's day and time, that the brain does not hold or track memories during traumatic events, rather than suppressing them or repressing them as previously believed. Researchers like Elizabeth Loftus, a lead American psychologist, has spent decades as the nation's leading expert on memory science. She's written and spoken about how repressed memories revealed in investigations are almost always false memories. Witnesses can create or piece together memories by what they've heard, seen, or been told by the investigators or other witnesses. So if Miss E was going to suddenly remember what happened by being hypnotized, it likely was going to be a false memory that her mind was piecing together after seeing crime scene photos or being suggestively questioned by the police. From what it seems in this case, though, the police did avoid leading questions or suggestive questioning. So Miss E, under hypnosis, didn't suddenly remember everything that happened. However, she was able to tell a sketch artist that she could remember the suspect's face barely. As he stabbed her, they were face to face. That shock, as she looked at him, she remembered it faintly. The artist worked to create a composite sketch of the assailant, which ended up just being a generic, nondescript man with dark glasses obscuring his eyes. The police did release the image to the public, but honestly, it was generic enough to fit every third middle-aged man on the street. And because of this generic picture that was plastered all over the newspapers, news, flyers, they also got a flood of tips calling into the station. When the police accept calls onto a tip line, there's always attention-seeking calls, people calling in their neighbor that they hate, or someone who says they might have seen something because they want a reward. But it always ends up leading nowhere. And they did. They got hundreds of calls like that, none of which led anywhere. The few men who did end up being questioned due to the calls all had alibis. With this being their only investigative tactic at the moment, hoping someone saw something, weeks were going by, and the suspect, Oigyun, was somewhere else, getting away with it. Of course, I've given you a little bit of a spoiler. I've told you his name, so you know eventually he will get caught. But it wouldn't be because of the tip line. The media was getting hounded for more updates on the case, so they started reporting that the case showed signs of long-term stagnation. The trail had gone cold, and the Daejeon police didn't know what else to do. However, there was a bit more to what they'd found at the crime scene than what we've discussed that they were working on behind the scenes. Oigyun's escape had been a complete opposite of his entrance and the attack. He came in cool, calm, collected. He sat after murdering Miss Che like he was waiting for his coffee to be served. But when he ran from Miss E, he was in a panic. The detectives searched every single way a person could leave the cafe for miles in every direction. And about 500 meters from the cafe, they found a piece of evidence. There was a wadded up tissue. At first, it looked just like a piece of discarded trash, but when they opened it, it was bloody. The blood on the tissue was tested, and like all of the other blood at the crime scene, it belonged to the two victims. But it also had the DNA of an unknown third person. This was their first physical evidence from the killer. Even the knife he left behind didn't have his DNA on it, meaning he was likely wearing gloves. From the spot the tissue was found, they expanded the perimeter another few miles in that direction. He had followed the Gumgang riverbanks away from the cafe. They started questioning fishermen who worked in the area, and one man, a fisherman who had been out later that day, had collected some trash from the water. Someone had thrown a dark piece of clothing into the river. It was a black sweater, which matched what Miss Che said that he was wearing. She said he was wearing dark clothes. This sweater was literally a gold mine for the case. Thankfully, the police bagged it and immediately sent the sweater into the National Forensics Lab without contaminating it any further. It had been in the river for hours, so it obviously was going to be degraded. But even after being submerged in the river, the luminol spray revealed the bloodstains. Lab analysis of the blood confirmed two things. First, that the two victims' blood was present, which proved that this was worn by the assailant. And second, it contained a full, complete genetic profile for the killer himself. The sweater also had a small pocket which contained a small bottle of Kravit brand eye drops. At first, they didn't think this was significant until they looked into the eye drops. Eye drops aren't exactly rare, but Kravit wasn't an over-the-counter brand solution. Kravit is a specific, very potent anti-inflammatory eye drop that's imported from Japan. It's only available with a prescription and was typically only given to patients recovering from cataract surgery. This was highly specific, which meant they had their work cut out for them. This single bottle would begin one of the most methodical and praised investigations to this day in Daejeon Police's history. The department is still known for the work that they did on this investigation, which they did do a great job at just plain old-fashioned police work. The lead detectives went out across the region. They were contacting hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, tracking every single prescription for Kravit eye drops that happened post-manufacturing date on the bottle. This led to them compiling a list of 1,922 individuals who had been prescribed the medication. This is a huge, massive suspect pool, but a step in the right direction. I get very happy when I get to praise the police work in these cases. And the Daejeon Police Station was also praised for their use of the National Forensics Laboratory. They took this case seriously from the first day, and this case took use of a new forensics technique called the YSTR analysis. Forgive me, my background is not in forensic criminology, so I hope I'm saying that right. This method analyzes the Y chromosome in the DNA sample. Y chromosomes are passed down by males and are typically unchanged through generations. While this wouldn't track a specific person, it would trace the killer's paternal lineage, which has a high degree of accuracy. And the results spoke for themselves. They found the O family lineage that the suspect belonged to. Of course, there are many branches of O families, just like there are probably hundreds of Smith lineages in America. But they were narrowing down that list of 1,922 eye drop users a lot. They cross-referenced the two sets of data, searching for any male on the list who had the last name O, or whose family came from O's. The list was instantly whittled down to just a few men, and one of them stood out, a 35-year-old security guard from Seoul, Oh E-gyun. So they had a name, and they ran a background check. They expected, since he wasn't in the criminal database, to find pretty much nothing, maybe some traffic violations. But when the results came back, they were shocked. This contextualized the entire incident. The man they had been hunting down wasn't a first-time killer. He was a convicted serial killer. The man they were searching for the last 50 days was a monster that the justice system had already caught once. And to understand the man, Oh Lee-gyun, who killed Miss Che, attempted to kill Miss E in 2007, we need to go back 18 years to a string of crimes so brutal they may not be explainable to when Oh Lee-gyun was just 17 years old in 1989. In Yeonggi County, a very rural collection of towns and villages that was mostly made up of farms, 17-year-old Oh Lee-gyun spent most of his time working on his father's farm. He had just dropped out of middle school a few years earlier, and by most accounts, he was a quiet kid. He wasn't particularly close to any other boys his age, and he wasn't known to cause any trouble. It would make life a sure lot easier if predators were predictable and foreseeable, but there aren't always signs that are easy to see. On January 11th, 1989, the body of a 69-year-old woman, Miss No, was discovered under a local bridge. She had been raped, savagely beaten, and stabbed to death. A few months later, on May 24th, a second victim was found. 62-year-old Miss Shim had been attacked while working alone in a soybean field near the Gumgang River. She too had been raped, beaten, and stabbed to death. The small community was terrified because someone had been preying on older women who were alone. No one, not even the police, suspected the teenage boy they saw every day working on his farm to be a killer. But then on August 12th, Oh Lee-gyun struck again. This time, he saw a 7-year-old kindergarten girl playing in front of his house on the street. He lured her away and took her to a nearby mountain behind the village where he attempted to sexually assault the child. When she screamed, cried, and begged to go home, he tried to silence her. He strangled her to death. Once she was dead, he left her body there on the mountain and just walked home. For the next hour, he returned to work and he just continued on about his day. But then he decided to return to the scene of the crime. He walked back up the mountain to where he had left the girl's body, took a knife, and mutilated her body post-mortem by stabbing the child's lifeless corpse repeatedly. Then he dug a shallow grave and buried her. There is very little information about the investigative work done in 1989, but 2 days later he was arrested, and under pressure of police questioning, he confessed to murdering the little girl. Then after time, he confessed to the murder of the 2 older women as well. You might be wondering, how did he ever get released from prison for murdering a child and 2 adult women so horrifically? Well, the South Korean justice system had and is still dealing with a fundamental problem. They had a killer who confessed to crimes that displayed a level of sexual sadism rarely seen in killers, let alone a teenager. But by law, as it's written at the time and still hasn't changed much, the law wasn't designed to punish a monster his age. The Juvenile Justice Code was built on a philosophy of rehabilitation, and it operated under the assumption that a young offender could always be reformed. And as a result, the law placed a hard ceiling on the maximum sentence a child can receive, regardless of the depravity of their crime. The law now does take into account the severity of their crimes, but it's still heavily criticized. At his trial in 1989, the court's hands were tied. The judges were looking at a 17-year-old, a minor, who had raped and murdered 2 women as well as a 7-year-old child. But under the law, the most severe punishment they were legally allowed to impose was 15 years in a correctional facility, which he did receive that maximum sentence. The judge did everything he was at power to do, and I think most of us can agree that's still inadequate, clearly, knowing who he grew up to be. But for the next 15 years, he sat in that correctional facility. He served the full time and was released in 2005. He left the correctional facility a free man at the age of 33. Since he had served his time and was a minor when he was charged, there was no registry, no public information about his conviction, no stain on his name. Oh Lee-gyun moved to Seoul and started to reconstruct his life. To my knowledge, there is no program that helps serial killers reintegrate into society, so he was on his own. Little is known about his day-to-day existence during the next 2 years, but he found work at a private security firm as a security guard. That is until April 2007 when he decided to go back to his old ways. So the police had identified him from the list of men prescribed the Kravit eye drops. They'd done his background check, identifying that he was a convicted serial killer who'd been out for 2 years, and now they had to move quickly. When they contacted his place of employment, they discovered he quit the month prior. He likely had an idea that he was going to be caught once again. What had tipped him off was that the police had contacted all of the men prescribed the eye drops with a request to come in for a DNA sample. As soon as he got that notification, he fled. But it didn't take the police long to locate him, and on July 4th, 2007, he was found hiding in the city of Gwangmyeong. When the police moved in, he offered no resistance. He just accepted his arrest. And the moment he was in custody, he knew he was caught. He immediately confessed to the robbery and murder at the Lily Cafe. The police asked his motive. Why would he suddenly reoffend? He offered the excuse that he had visited his father's grave, he lost his money at the gambling arcade, and when he realized he couldn't even afford his trip home, he felt like his life was over. He had nothing more to live for. He says that when he walked into the cafe, he only planned to rob the place. But when Miss Che came in, he was startled by her and had to threaten her to stay quiet. So he killed her in a moment of panic. However, once the prosecution started looking into his life the days leading up to the incident, it was obvious he was lying. Just the day before, he spent 80,000 won with a sex worker, and he had money in the bank prior to gambling all of his life savings. The train ticket money wasn't his motive. It was just an excuse to let out the violence he always had inside him. He was just waiting for an excuse to snap again. And it wasn't a coincidence that that day he had visited the Kumgang River, the same area that he had killed the 2 elderly women and the 7-year-old child. At his trial, the prosecution laid out that Oh Lee-gyun was not a man who murdered 1 woman and attempted to murder another. No, he had murdered 4 people and attempted to murder a 5th. Because he was convicted in 1989, they could use his prior crimes as a documented history of his behavior. So they described him as a man who didn't snap in a moment of desperation, but a lifelong predator who had been given a second chance, and he used that second chance to kill again. Because of his pattern of behavior, they demanded the death penalty this time around. The court, however, decided to see the crimes differently. The judges did acknowledge that his crimes were brutal, and they ultimately decided it didn't demand the death penalty. On October 25th, 2007, Oh Lee-gyun was sentenced to life in prison. The judge's official statement was that during his first conviction, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and so they were disregarding any displays of remorse he was showing during the trial. It said that he was hanging his head low and acting quite remorseful. They said that his actions weren't pure evil, but a result of a disordered mind. They didn't believe a man who sexually assaulted, strangled, and then returned to stab repeatedly a 7-year-old child's corpse would be capable of regret, regardless of what was going on. While I don't have concrete opinions about the death penalty, it hasn't been carried out in Korea in a long while, so the death penalty is more a sentence without the chance for parole. Oh Lee-gyun's case seems simple. He was a man who wanted to kill since he was in his teens, and he did, without reserve. He was not a man who was driven to murder by circumstance. Rather, he used his circumstance as an excuse to just go ahead and murder. Oh Lee-gyun was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which is often used interchangeably with psychopathy, but psychopathy, as defined by the National Institute of Health, does share comorbidities with ASPD, but psychopathy is almost exclusively used to describe criminal populations, so it's not really known as a disorder, rather a descriptor for a set of personality deficits. ASPD, on the other hand, is a behavior-based personality disorder. It affects about 1 to 4% of the population. We discuss it so often on this podcast because to this day in Korean courts and media, ASPD and psychopathy are pretty much used interchangeably. I'm sure that is very annoying to actual psychologists. So while ASPD and psychopathy are very similar and are highly comorbid with one another, they're not equal. Key differences are important, but a person can have ASPD and psychopathy. So while Oh-gyun was diagnosed with ASPD, he was given the psychopathy test, the PCLR, which is a great test, gold standard diagnostic assessment, but it's more of a screening for psychopathic traits. I thought I would take the time to talk more about the differences since surely we are going to discuss another criminal with ASPD or psychopathy in the future. Briefly, according to the National Health Institute, almost all cases of psychopathy meet the criteria for ASPD, whereas only a small portion of those with ASPD meet the criteria of psychopathy. So most psychologists seem to consider psychopathy to be a very extreme form of ASPD. But there are some variations, of course. There's still a lot of studies going into understanding the difference of those disorders. At the moment, though, psychopathy isn't a diagnosable disorder and is typically only used in the criminal justice world. So with that said, Oh-gyun did have many traits of psychopathy, such as a lack of a rational link between cause and effect, distinguishing between minor and major inconveniences, like him not having train money leading to homicidal violence. For an individual like Oh-gyun, the concept of rehabilitation was never going to work. He wasn't a troubled boy who had been exposed to violent media, violent adults, or been abused. He chemically and likely permanently was different than those around him. Like a person with depression isn't going to be fixed by the same methods used to cheer up a sad child. Oh-gyun's extreme violence, sexual assaults, and post-mortem desecrations were the primary objectives of his crimes. For him, the act of murder was about domination, terror, and brutalization of the victim, which gave him psychological gratification he wasn't getting anywhere else. No one thought he'd ever be capable of such violence, and that comes with the masking of intentions that's outlined in Hare's PCLR's psychopathy test. He had pathological impulsivity, poor behavior control, but he could always hide behind being a nice enough guy that lives in your neighborhood. Social control theory tells us that his detachment from pretty much all social relationships removed any typical barrier and restraint that most youth have on delinquent behavior. Having close relationships and good influences usually reduces your risk of having delinquent behavior. His personality traits make him very resistant to rehabilitation because at their core, rehabilitation is trying to improve a person's behavior by encouraging them to see the benefits of conforming. Oh-gyun had no use for social norms. He had no desire to develop empathy because he saw no use in relationships at all. The only person he ever seemed to care for was his own father, who passed away while he was in prison. His reoffending wasn't just likely, it was predictable, especially since the rehabilitation program he underwent tried to cure his behavior, rather than understand that this is a permanent disorder that would need to be managed with long-term treatment. When I first approached this case and was just casually discussing it with my husband, I brought up that there is a real conflict between the rehabilitation and retribution in the criminal justice system. In 1989, his juvenile sentencing was based on a rehabilitative model that really didn't account for all forms of personality disorders or just individual differences. It was a very rigid, one-size-fits-all program. Because they failed to adapt the program to his needs and his behaviors, his 15-year sentence really didn't do anything to deter him from acting violent again. It was just 15 years of being bored and waiting to get out. Their risk assessment failed, and they failed to see the danger and risk he posed to others. So, a little bit, they're also at fault for the death of Miss Che and attempted murder of Miss E. The police investigating him in 2007 were a gold standard for police work in contrast. They followed every lead they could, they narrowed down suspects using the eye drop prescriptions, and they found him hiding in another city. This was the first case that this jurisdiction had ever used that familial DNA analysis to catch a criminal. It was a risk for them because the familial DNA is a probability investigation, whether or not they'd have enough genetic information to track his family line. Similar technology was used very recently to catch the East Area rapist in America. So it's interesting to see that while the rehabilitation program was a complete failure, that has fault for the death of Miss Che by failing to identify that Oh-gyun was still a danger to society. On the other hand, we do see the progress in the criminal justice system. The problem is that the criminal justice system is so case-based that capturing and locking away criminals is becoming easier than figuring out how to solve the problem of preventing these crimes by understanding psychology. I've mentioned before that I am a big proponent of rehabilitation, but we must understand that no two people are the same. The same help will not work for different people. Rehabilitation's purpose is to help the offender or convict learn empathy, understand the harm they've caused, or change their thinking to adhere to social norms, mainly those of following the law and avoiding harming others. One of such ways is that prisoners can be offered cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on changing negative thoughts and behaviors to positive ones, which improves their mental well-being, which I've actually had success in my own life with my anxiety in therapy. But for someone who's identified as a psychopath, this can be counterproductive. They learn therapy language. They learn how to speak about remorse. They learn how to mimic what others want from them without there being a genuine want to change. This creates advanced manipulation skills that Oigyun manifested in him pretending to be remorseful during his 2007 trial. But thankfully, the judges saw through that act. Another failure of rehabilitation for psychopaths is that empathy training or teaching will not work. You'd have as much success teaching a colorblind person to see the color red by just talking to them about what it looks like. They can learn to identify with the right words, like identifying that an apple is red. Or a psychopath can listen to a person's story about losing their job and know that that is what empathy looks like, but they won't experience it. They can learn to be remorseful, but not feel remorseful. Programs that focus on management rather than curing their disorder are much more successful. They, in and of themselves, are not bad people. They're not evil people. They just have a condition. There are many people with ASPD that are not criminals, have never broken a law, will never break a law. But a person identified as a psychopath will have a harder time avoiding this. According to Dr. Dennis Reedy, violence is typically a defining factor of psychopathy. Unfortunately, modern studies on psychopathy have found that there really is not a solution yet to reduce the risk of violence in these persons' lives. The studies at the moment are quite bleak. There is optimism that with high psychopathy, people who receive intensive, structured, long-term treatment, there is a greater reduction in violence than those who don't get treatment. The goal is reducing violent behavior rather than fundamentally changing their emotional capacity. Unfortunately, the group that benefits most from this treatment is children who are still developing. So by the time the criminal justice system met Oigyun, he was already a part of a difficult-to-treat population. Oigyun will spend the rest of his days in Daejeon prison, never knowing what remorse feels like. This case is a story that we learn very little from, and that's frustrating to hear. It's frustrating for me to say. A man who wanted to commit senseless violence did. Thank you for joining me on Korean True Crime. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it or leave a review. Check the description for a link to our Discord, Patreon, or find my new merch. Find my sources on Patreon for free. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. 다음에 또 봐요. See you next time.